Hello, welcome back to I'm a Neurodivergent, recapping my neurodivergent discovery year. We're having a bit of a heat wave here in London, so apologies if I'm like 93% liquid by the end of this. The last few weeks I've been recapping my course notes from the University of Kent's Understanding Autism course. For this week, I'm 25 weeks into my self-discovery year, so we're June 2022 at this point, and I was finally starting to think more about anxiety. Anxiety, much like autism and ADHD, was something I had retrospectively struggled with for decades, but much like autism and ADHD was just something that wasn't on my radar for decades. I was too busy trying to get by and keeping my head above water to realise there was anything unusual going on with me. We've spoken a bit previously about anxiety being one of the big three co-occurring conditions that can sit alongside autism, the big three being anxiety, ADHD, and learning disability, that tend to be autism's primary dance partners of choice. The National Autistic Society estimates around 40 to 50% of autistic people will also receive a clinical diagnosis of anxiety. I did when I got my ASD diagnosis. But that's just with a clinical diagnosis. I suspect the vast majority of autistic people, whether you've got a formal diagnosis or not, suffer with anxiety. Stats from the Anxiety Disorders Association of America also put about 50% of adults with ADHD as also suffering from an anxiety disorder. So whichever way you cut it, your odds are stacked pretty good that if you're neurodivergent, you're also going to be battling the anxiety monster to some extent. And that anxiety all comes down to trying to get by in a world you don't quite get and that doesn't quite seem set up for you. Everything's just slightly off, like the world's an old TV that's not picking up the signal right. But basics first. What is anxiety? It's one of the most fundamental mental health conditions and can affect neurodivergent and neurotypical brains alike. Common aspects of anxiety include generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety, which is fear of social situations, agoraphobia, fear of open spaces and crowds, and other more specific fears, which are often called phobias. Now, before you get the anticipated invalidation, yes, everyone worries. Of course, you're going to be nervous and anxious before, like, a job interview, for example. But anxiety can become a problem when those sporadic or occasional feelings of worry and panic become persistent, pervasive, overwhelming, and beyond an individual's ability to control and manage them. They take over, and the very way you are in the world becomes this dark cloud of anxiety. It consumes you and everything you do and think. And it can be really hard to see that's what you've become when you're inside that cloud. Really hard to realize you might need a bit of help to break free from it. A healthy level of anxiety, there is such a thing, triggers your body's primal adrenaline response, your fight or flight response, when required, and when your brain perceives danger and prepares your body to defend itself, like if you're attacked or if you have to jump out of the way of a speeding car. But when you get stuck in fight or flight, or even freeze mode, as autistic people often do, your brain and body's anxiety response can become almost constantly triggered by things you only perceive to be threats to you, like unexpected noises, unexpected demands, having to interact with people, as well as things that actually are threats that put us in danger. And when you get stuck in this doom loop of thinking you're under threat when you're not, anxiety can become a big problem that you need to address, and sooner rather than later, before it causes you to unravel. The most common physical symptoms of anxiety can include racing heart, shortness of breath, feeling agitated or overwhelmed, shaking, sweating, stomachache and feeling nauseous, tightness in the chest, numbness and tingling, blurred vision, heavy legs. My normal caveat with these sorts of videos, similar to the ones I've done on imposter syndrome, BFRBs, fawning, just because you have anxiety does not mean you are autistic or neurodivergent. Autistic people just have way higher incidences of anxiety than your average run-of-the-mill bear, hence why it's important to address it as part of an autism and neurodivergence video series. If you're coming to this video without watching any of the other ones first, please do go back and watch chapter 1, take an online AQ test and reflect whether there's a chance you may be neurodivergent. This video is about co-occurring autism and anxiety and why that co-occurrence tends to be so common. Just as an aside, I will get more specifically onto ADHD and the aspects of co-occurring autism and ADHD, I promise. I'm just trying to broadly sequentially track my discovery year, and it was still just autism for me at this point, 6 months in. As with so many things neurodivergent, there's so much crossover between autism and ADHD that a lot of this autism and anxiety video will be relevant to both, but I will also do a future video specifically on anxiety and ADHD and how those two goodies interact in similar but different ways. Aside over. On me as an individual, if you'd asked me as recently as 2 or 3 years ago whether I suffered from anxiety, I would have instinctively said no. Much like both autism and ADHD, like I said, it just wasn't on my radar. I just spent my days being fully focused on getting through the day and looking like I was on top of everything. That kind of mental health struggle was something other people had. Not me, though. Definitely not me. I was coping. I didn't need help or therapy or any of those things that the sad, broken people needed. I was smashing life. But if you'd asked me if I ever got a racing heart, shortness of breath, felt agitated or overwhelmed, got the shakes, the sweats and the sick feelings, I'd have been like, yeah, sure, all the time, when I get myself worked up over something stupid. But I eventually calm down, stop shaking, stop sweating, stop pacing about angrily and having arguments in my head, and it eventually passes and I catch my breath and get on with my day. Because I, for the most part, not always, a few embarrassing exceptions, because I had broadly managed to hide my panic attacks and anxiety meltdowns from others, I guess I'd deluded myself that it wasn't really a thing, just a little private moment I had to myself every now and again that I needed to get out of my system sometimes. Like the ways in which I lacked self-awareness or curiosity about my own behaviours for most of my days are pretty staggering in retrospect. The reason I'm only really getting to anxiety now, 6 months into my discovery year, is because even though I got a dual diagnosis of autism and anxiety, the anxiety seemed almost like an insignificant add-on, and I'd kept my focus on learning primarily about autism to this point because that seemed like the significant bit of my diagnosis. But in retrospect, that was a pretty big mistake. The two things need to be considered holistically. When people have anxiety attacks, it's basically because they feel out of control of something in a given situation. And this, in part, explains why anxiety can be so commonly found alongside autism, because we have a tendency to need and strive for feeling in control of our environments more than your average bear, right? Autistic anxiety in particular can be triggered by a range of things. Change and uncertainty, pressures, demands and expectations, unfamiliar social situations, or anticipating situations that have stressed you out previously. Sensory triggers like noises, lighting or smells, and pretty much the whole world outside of the room we're in can trigger us, right? And beyond the physical symptoms of anxiety I already mentioned, there's next a common range of responses we might tilt into once we've lost that feeling of control and anxiety's taken over. These can be anything from seeking lots of reassurances from others that things are going to be okay, avoidance techniques like just not going to school or work or the social event that's stressing us out, running away from a situation, the flight response, trying to impose routine and sameness onto a situation to avoid unpredictability, and unpredictable things happening, obviously being one of our key triggers, through to meltdowns, tantrums, or emotional outbursts to let people know we're upset and can't bottle things up anymore, or if things get really bad, then self-harm. Anxiety's generally seen as an adult thing once we've had a chance to build up all sorts of neuroses and trauma responses as the world gradually batters us down. But this stat from Autistica is pretty stark. While only 3% of neurotypical children suffer from anxiety, 42% of autistic children suffer from anxiety. The world really does start freaking us the fuck out right from the get-go, and we don't like it. By the time autistic kids become autistic adults, 79% of us will have mental health issues because the world chips away, and we were starting from a low base to begin with huge swathes of us not getting the help and support we need to manage our mental health, and we go year after year through the same ringer. I have absolutely no stats to back this up, and maybe it's confirmation bias, but anecdotally I've been talking to a lot of undiagnosed autistic people who got by, coped, didn't realise they were playing with a different set of cards, and hit their wall in their early 40s. It does seem to be a prime time for a neurodivergent brain that hasn't had any help and support to say, enough now, we're done with this, and either have a bit of a breakdown or basically find they can't work or function anymore without some help getting out of the hole. So why do so many of us not get the help we need? A, because if you're a completely unself-aware idiot like me, you probably think you're doing all right. You cope pretty well. You've taught yourself to look past your anxiety meltdowns and panic attacks because you get over them and you think, probably be alright. You're like that dog in the meme with a coffee mug in the burning house, sitting there in the flames, repeating, this is fine, this is fine. But also, B, you might well realise there's a problem in your noodle, but find going to the doctor or asking for professional help too stressful. And having strapped the mask on that you're coping for so many years, it can be hard to take that off and say you're not coping. It's why so many of us wait until we hit a wall before addressing mental health and anxiety. If I could go back and have my time again, I would reach out for help so much sooner than I did, but it's such a double-edged sword because so many of us don't realise we need help until it's too late and we're drowning. Talking to a therapist early at that first sign of feeling frayed around the edges has to be the right thing to do. Now, you can go through your healthcare system, but as I've been hearing time and time again from people who've reached out, the healthcare system, or indeed also well-meaning friends or colleagues, can very easily not get what you're trying to say, fob you off with cookie-cutter responses, like, have you tried mindfulness, going for a walk, having a swim? And that's got its place, 100%. But if you can afford it, and you'd be surprised what you can afford if you make room for it, I would recommend, if you're having a bit of a mental health crisis now, Google anxiety therapists / anxiety therapy in whatever area you live. If you know or are pretty confident you have autism or ADHD, Google autism or ADHD anxiety therapy in your area. And if there's none in your area, go nationwide. The vast majority of therapists do Skype or Zoom or other video calls now, so you can connect with someone from anywhere. Just start talking to someone. And tip, many therapists will offer either a free or reduced rate introductory session. So absolutely do shop around and find someone you click with or that you feel gets you, and someone who understands the neurodivergent angle to all of this. If you genuinely cannot afford to speak to a therapist, search around for a supportive Facebook group or whatever social media you use. Just people who've been through the journey and are sharing their experiences in ways that you recognize yourself in. But a trained therapist with good testimonials, or that someone who gets you has recommended, who gets your issues and doesn't try to fob you off or not listen properly, and is bought into helping you feel better about yourself and your place in the world is invaluable. Like Bob Hoskins used to say, it's good to talk. You'll probably be offered, if you go this route, a mix of talking therapy and CBT, which is cognitive behavioural therapy, which is a type of therapy that focuses on changing the interplay between negative thoughts, feelings, and behaviours once you and your therapist have worked out what's triggering your anxiety and what might be able to, at least in part, help you challenge and reframe your negative thoughts about yourself or the world and limit the effect the way you think about things, which is a conscious choice, has on your behaviours and emotions. CBT can be hard work, and it does take work. It's not as passive as talking therapy, but it can also help you set goals and learn specific coping strategies for anxiety that work for you as an individual to gain insight into how the way you frame your thoughts can trip you up and help you feel more resilient and able to take more control over the way you think and behave. Be more calmly observational and less reactive to the things that wind you up, basically. It takes time, and I would in no way say that I'm fixed even after doing some of this stuff, but what I would say is it's very, very worth it to just start thinking about the way you think about things in a slightly more productive way, particularly if it's not something you've ever tried before. Getting introduced to talking therapy and CBT have absolutely been a game changer for me in terms of anxiety, but it's a game that keeps needing to be played. There's a ton of what are called thinking traps to unpick once you get into this. Things like black and white thinking, like anything less than perfect is failure. Mind reading, everyone thinks I'm stupid. Overgeneralizing, I'm never good at X, Y, or Z. Negative self-labeling, I'm stupid, I'm a loser. Catastrophizing, worst case scenario. Should or must statements that put pressure on yourself, or only allowing yourself to see or hear the negative things that confirm what you thought, refusing to see or hear any of the positives. And undoing years worth of unhealthy thinking patterns, it isn't a quick fix, a finger snap, sorted now solution that will involve different elements for different people, but I would strongly urge everyone who struggles with anxiety, whether autistic, ADHD, otherwise neurodivergent, or even if you're just a normie with a mean reds, just take the plunge and give it a go. What's the worst that can happen? You're already threadbare, torn, and frayed, just hoping to get through the week, right? Your happiness and mental health is too important to put off talking to someone about it. It's not something for a rainy day. It's not something to think about after you break. Think about it now and go for it. CBT helps you understand the link between thought, symptom, and behaviour. Like thought, I'm nervous about having to make a presentation. Symptom, I'm sweating and my heart's racing. Behaviour, I'm going to find an excuse and get out of this demand that's been placed on me. And like we said, a certain level of anxiety is helpful. It's your body's smoke alarm system. So we don't want to get rid of anxiety, just bring our response to it down to a manageable level by helping us realise what's a genuine threat to us and what's just a perceived threat to us. And a therapist will work with you to work out what your individual triggers are, how to recognise you've been triggered, and how to calm yourself down before you go into a full meltdown over whatever it is. Recognising your specific anxiety responses and mental and physical manifestations early is absolutely key to catching the anxiety attack early before it escalates. And that is hard, just to reiterate. That takes work, and in my experience it really helps talking to someone external to ask you the right questions rather than trying to work all this out and mitigate it on your own. Yeah, just recognizing you're in a fight, flight, freeze response and getting yourself back out of it when you suffer from anxiety or having an anxiety attack it's a really hard hole to dig yourself out of. It broadly starts with slow breathing, preferably through your nose, and just grounding yourself. But what comes next can be quite individual to us, and if there's someone who knows what they're doing with a rope or a ladder who thinks they can help get you out of the hole. I know this can be hard for a lot of us, but try to trust them, try to listen to them. You're independent enough to work out whether what they're saying works for you or not. I guess do not fear therapy, and I say that as someone who definitely feared therapy before starting it. The key oversimplified difference between anxiety and depression is depression is feeling bad about what has happened, and anxiety is feeling bad about what might happen. CBT is about challenging your expectations around what might happen and reframing the worst case catastrophizing we tend to do into more realistic thought patterns by asking things like, am I sure this worst case scenario will happen? What's the evidence this worst case scenario will happen? If the worst case scenario did happen, what would I do to cope with it or handle it? Would I be able to bounce back from it if it did happen? What benefits might I get out of the situation if it went better than I anticipate? Is it more or less likely to go well or to go horrendously? Might the potential benefit of a good outcome outweigh the potential consequence of a bad outcome? And am I prepared to take the risk to try to control the anxiety and push through the anxiety to see what happens and retrain my brain that the worst case scenario rarely or never happens? Now, this reframing is all super difficult for neurotypical brains that suffer from anxiety, let alone autistic brains. And as I've gone through in recent videos, autistic brains find it harder to make cognitive shortcuts and have an inbuilt X plus Y equals Z framework. Neuroplasticity and learning new behaviors and thought processes can at times be 100% more challenging for us. It's not impossible, but it's definitely more challenging. If we're serious about getting on top of anxiety, then every time we think of a worst case scenario situation, we have to deconstruct that negative narrative and construct a new narrative from scratch every time. And ways of doing that will be different for different people, like I said. But we love a system, right? And this is about finding a system that works for us and works for our individual brains. For me, I think getting there is 50% having a guide, whether that's a therapist or psychiatrist or just someone else who's gone through it, and 50% working out for yourself what your system is that's going to work for you to retrain your brain out of anxiety. That's the unbeatable tag team, your solutions and systems focused brain and a guiding hand, not autism and anxiety as the unbeatable tag team. You can't shake off your autism, and nor should you want to. It's your fundamental brain coding. But you can shake off the anxiety, or at least dilute it down into a manageable state. But this is hard. I made a big mistake in thinking anxiety was an insignificant part of being autistic after getting my double diagnosis. And if you're on the spectrum and recognize anxiety as being a blocker for you in your life, maybe you found yourself in this kind of denial spot too. Learning how to elevate your strengths and mitigate your challenges as an autistic individual is so much about learning to manage and mitigate your anxiety. I'm conscious this video doesn't even really scratch the surface of such a big subject area, and maybe we'll do an even deeper dive into specific tools and techniques in future. But yeah, I hope it's been a bit of a useful warning flare to take anxiety seriously. Start thinking about it if you haven't already. Start looking into it and not just dismiss it as an intrinsic part and parcel of the autistic condition and autistic experience. It is, but it doesn't have to be forever, is the point I think I'm trying to make. With help and guidance, it can definitely become less of an albatross for us. Right, I cannot get into the habit of making these shorter. Sorry, I know these video lengths can be a bit of a struggle, but peace out for now. Like, share, subscribe, drop me an email if you like, and yeah, hope this was sort of helpful, and see you next Sunday. Cheers.